Nobody wants to be a plebeian or a peasant. And yet, when laws are applied differently to one class of people than it is to another, if with certain protesters you kneel before them and others you beat them to within an inch of their life and arrest them and fine them £10,000, you have a clear class divide which emerges, which isn't necessarily the old class divides which you had, but certainly reflects it in that the views of certain classes will go in a certain direction and the views of other classes will go in a different one. Views which are popular among the very wealthy because they can afford to have those views and show off these views. The sort of signaling of wealth, not through having an expensive watch, because most people in the modern society we live in can afford one, but through having expensive views, is something which has been looked at quite extensively by various different people in various different places. And you'll see that the people who are most against, for instance, a stable marriage or the nuclear family are often people who are incredibly wealthy, grew up in nuclear families, and go on to have their own nuclear families. They can afford to have these sort of views. A poor person is crazy, is mad. A wealthy person is eccentric. Now, people's views aren't actually what they think and believe. And we know this from economics and we know this from people's behaviors. For instance, Americans were very against most of the things Donald Trump said and did. And they don't like his type of behavior and his brashness. And yet in their behavior and their voting and in their behavior in how they do things and who they hire, their views were very different. I actually wrote quite an article about this when Donald Trump was elected. And you also see, for instance, LGBT people. They're very, very well respected in liberal cities in America. And yet, if you want to look at who's on the streets, it's LGBT people. Black people in America, highly, highly respected. And yet, it's their businesses, their neighborhoods being burnt down by the left-wing activists. So what does that tell you? It tells you that what people say is not what they actually believe. What people say in more anonymized polls changes very distinctly from what they say, for instance, to a pollster who speaks. You see the polling method of having a robot call you, and the robot then has you enter keys. And people's voting intentions change, and change quite extensively. So how does this relate to the UK lockdown and to Boris Johnson enforcing it more? Now, Boris Johnson's done what his experts and his doctors and what Twitter's no doubt told him to do, and is locking down further, despite the fact that the World Health Organization now says that that's not the right way to combat the virus, and that it increases inequality and poverty for the poorest. And what do you see? You see your so-called peasant classes, your ordinary people, going out in these mass street parties and partying. Why? Well, they saw that when individuals went out and did things, when there were parties for a child in a garden, nicely socially distanced, they got arrested. When you see people having very peaceful protests during the lockdown period, they got £10,000 fines, they got arrested, they got beaten by police, they got chased. And then you see protesters actually doing physical damage, committing iconoclasm, and they're perfectly fine. They often don't get jail time. They have the police literally kneel before them. And when the football hooligans come out, again, the football hooligans get arrested and spend a lot of time in jail. So what you have then is one of two things. You either have the emergence of an aristocratic class, but Britain already has one, and in fact the aristocratic class, as seen by the behaviour of Prince Harry in particular, who can actually speak, is quite left-wing. It's quite supportive of these sort of issues, even if they're not really issues in Britain, as they might or might not be in America. Or you have a situation of the breakdown of rule of law. And the problem with that is rule of law is not merely something which is in theory, it's something which is in the psyche of the people. If people feel that they are being treated like peasants in a democracy, they are unlikely to obey the law. If they feel that what politicians are doing is not making their own decisions on things, but instead making decisions based on what people who have every incentive to be as harsh as possible, have to say, then they might not listen to it. And if they feel that people are making decisions based on what people say on Twitter, which, sorry to say, but has quite a left-wing bias and quite a authoritarian bias, in fact, then they might not, in fact, be making the decisions people on the ground want. Because the polls, generally speaking, disagree with what is said on Twitter, which shows that it's actually very left-leaning what's said on Twitter. And Twitter has often been accused of having a bias against large accounts by people who are more conservative. So it skews it left. It's not your general public. Now, when Ireland announced that they were going to ignore the experts and not take us into level 5 lockdown and instead have us in level 3, which is quite a reasonable level of lockdown, to be honest, there was a lot of outrage in the comment sections of newspapers and on Twitter. But the general people, in any case, they may well say in polls that they support lockdowns and the like, but the moment they leave any store, they'll take their mask off, the vast majority of them. The moment they have an opportunity, they don't social distance. Why is that? Well, it's because they might take the virus at some level of seriousness, but they're not as fanatical as some polls would have you believe, and they're not as fanatical as Twitter would have you believe. In fact, what they actually believe is slightly different from what they would have you believe. Now, there is, of course, the problem that our infection rates have gone up, although the death rates don't seem to have. It seems to be mostly people who aren't dying of it who are getting it. And that's partially because the medical community has become much better at dealing with the coronavirus. And it's also partly because it's mostly young people who are getting it. The thing about it, though, is that by not taking Ireland to level 5, the Irish government has not lost its moral authority, it's kept it. It's managed to make a decision which satisfies not just those who are loudest, but those who are the ordinary people who will either obey the laws or not. And in Ireland, you have a largely rural type of population. A lot of us live in smaller towns or villages. And you can't necessarily have the Garda just pitch up everywhere and just enforce these sort of things. And even in the UK, you can't have that. So a government needs moral authorities to stand. And when you have a harsh lockdown without moral authority, the lockdown is not going to work. When you have a lockdown which has moral authority and which is tapered to a certain degree so as to get buy-in of the average person, then you have a lot more success with it. And I think that the UK needs to be more aware of that. And while it's all good and well to condemn massive house parties and massive street parties on Twitter, the question then is why, despite all of the previous ones being condemned, are people still doing it? And it's probably because they know that while they might be condemned on Twitter, their friends aren't going to condemn them for it because they view the actual measures as unreasonable. So the best thing the UK can do is have more reasonable measures and approach things in a more rational way. The sort of way someone who gets 8 hours sleep will approach things rather than the sort of way someone who is drugged up on coffee and tweeting furiously on Twitter would approach something.